all the singleton beans, they are going to be eagerly initialized by the Spring IOC container during the startup of the application itself. I can also prove you this point. I'll keep a breakpoint at line number 12. So at line number 11, what we are trying to do? We are trying to initialize the Spring context. As soon as the line number 11 is executed, all the singleton beans inside my application, they are going to be eagerly initialized by the Spring IOC container. If I execute this program, you'll be able to see inside the console, there is a statement my service created from the constructor of the my service class. So this gives an confirmation to us that the IOC container is trying to create all the singleton beans eagerly during the initialization of the Spring context. But this can be a drawback in some scenarios. Let me show you one example. Before that, let me release this breakpoint and stop the running of the program. Now, what I'm going to do is, I'm going to remove these 3 lines of code. Now, I have only a single line inside my main method, which is going to take care of initializing the Spring context. I'm not referring to the my service bean anywhere inside my business logic. If I execute this program, still the bean of my service is created eagerly by the IOC container. Do you see there is a problem here? The developer never used this my service bean inside the business logic. Maybe they might have defined this bean definition for some reason, but they are not using inside the business logic. Or there might be also a possibility that a singleton bean will not be used in all type of scenarios. There will be a very remote scenario where it is going to be used. For such scenarios, creating the singletons bean eagerly will not be a good option because your application end up creating too many beans during the startup and it has to maintain all of those beans inside the Spring context, which may bring some performance issues as well. In real applications, we'll have thousands of singleton beans, and if the Spring IOC container try to create all those beans during the startup of the application, it may have some performance issue. That's why there is a flexibility given inside the Spring framework to control when the singleton bean should be created by the Spring IOC container. The default behavior is Spring IOC container always going to create the singleton bean during the startup of the application or during the initialization of the Spring context. But we can change this behavior by mentioning an annotation at lazy. With the lazy annotation, I'm telling to the Spring framework, don't create the bean of this class during the startup of the application. Instead, always create the bean of this instance when someone is trying to refer the bean for the very first time. I can show you a demo with this setup. I'll go to the Spring main.java. This time, if I execute this program, I will not see any statement from the constructor. That means my bean is never created during the initialization of the Spring context because I'm nowhere referring to the bean inside the business logic. Now, let's bring the 3 statements that we have previously. This time inside my business logic, I'm trying to load the bean of my service from the context. At this point of time only, the bean is going to be created. I can keep a breakpoint at line number 11. Let me show you the console as well. If I move on to the next line, though at the line number 11, the Spring context is initialized, my bean is not created yet. But as soon as line number 12 is executed, where I'm trying to refer to the bean of my service from the context, at this specific point of time, the Spring IOC container is going to create the singleton bean. So let me go to the next line and you'll be able to see my service is created. In the next line, I'm again trying to refer to the same bean from the context. Since this is a singleton bean, my Spring IOC container will not create the object from scratch. Instead, it is going to share the same bean reference that it has created at the line number 12. If I move on to the next line, there is no constructor statement again. If I release this entire program, at the end, we are going to get the output as true. This is how we can control when an singleton bean should be created by the Spring IOC container. By default, all the singleton beans, they are going to be created eagerly during the startup of the application. In case if you have a specific scenario where a particular singleton bean is not going to be used greatly inside your application and it is going to be used only in some specific remote scenarios, all such singleton beans, you can mark them as lazy to achieve some performance improvements inside your application. I have prepared this slide which is going to explain you the differences between the eager initialization and lazy initialization of the singleton scope. This concept of eager and lazy, it is only applicable for the singleton scope beans, because singleton scope beans, they are going to be created only once. Don't try to take this concept to other scopes like prototype. This concept is not applicable for them. As I said, the very first difference is eager initialization is the default behavior inside the Spring framework. Whereas to achieve the lazy initialization, we need to explicitly configure @lazy annotation on top of the singleton bean. With the eager initialization, the singleton bean will be created during the startup of the application, whereas in the scenario of lazy, the singleton bean will be created when the app or the business logic is trying to refer the bean for the first time. When we are using eager initialization, the server will not start if a bean is not able to create due to any dependent exceptions. Whereas with the lazy setup, your server is going to start successfully, but the application will throw the exception at runtime if the lazy bean is failed to create due to any dependent exceptions. So this is a very important point that you need to consider. If there are some critical beans inside your application, you need to mark them eager. With the help of eager, your application startup itself is going to fail and you can react very quickly. Whereas low priority beans or remote scenarios beans, you can mark them as lazy. In this scenario, the application startup is going to be successful unless someone is testing the business scenario where the lazy singleton is being used. They won't see any exceptions inside the application. But the moment they are trying to test that remote scenario, they are going to have a surprise dynamically at the runtime. So you need to be cautious in selecting either eager or lazy initialization for your singleton bean. So always do that due diligence with your team members. Once finalized, you can proceed with your decision. If you try to create all your singleton beans eagerly, then Spring context will occupy lot of memory. For example, if your application has 1,000 different singleton beans, if all these 1,000 different beans are initialized using eager, then obviously these 1,000 different beans information has to be stored inside the Spring context, which is going to take some memory. That's why don't try to create all the beans eagerly. Mark few of the non-important beans or the remote scenario beans with lazy initialization, so that only the minimum required beans they are going to be created during the startup of the application. Similarly, you should also not try creating all your singleton beans with the lazy, because the performance of the application is going to be impacted. Since the beans are not created during the startup, all the lazy beans they are going to be created the moment the business logic is going to be executed. While an end user is trying to perform some actions on the application, at that point of time, the lazy beans they are going to be created. There will be some performance problems if all your beans are getting created during the runtime. That's why you need to balance between the easy and lazy initialization in bigger applications. If your application is very small, where you have only hundreds of singleton beans, then you don't need to worry much. You can go with the default behavior of eager initialization. And the last difference is eager initialization should be used for all the beans that are going to be required very commonly inside an application. Whereas the lazy approach can be followed for the beans that are used in a very remote scenario inside an application. I hope you're clear with the concept of eager and lazy initialization of the singleton beans. As I said, this concept is only applicable for the singleton scope.